Hello, I'm the third med student today. I'm a fourth year, so I'll be matching tomorrow. So if we get a first year, we will have the full set. Alrighty, so this is our analysis. We're looking at oversewing or any staple line treatments in robotic sleeve gastrectomies. I have no disclosures, but while we wait this out, I'd like to say thank you to the UNC Surgical Department, Dr. Farrell, Dr. Zhao for helping me be here, and also the Wake Med Health and Hospital Surgical Department, without whom I would not be applying to surgery. So the background is, there's a lot of acronyms, so bear with me, guys. LSGs, so laparoscopic sleeve gastrectomies, now the most common restrictive and also bariatric procedure in general. RSG is a version of that where you're using a robot. A little bit of debate over what exactly that means. Some surgeons still use laparoscopic staplers while using the robot to set up the procedure, but the MBSAQIP database does not differentiate between those. So anything that utilized a robot is classified as RSG for this purpose. Staple line treatments are things that people have tried to do to avoid the two feared complications of sleeve gastrectomy, which is bleeding and leakage. For the purposes of this talk, staple line treatment refers to either buttressing or oversewing. And buttressing is a staple line reinforcement using materials, usually some type of vicryl or polyglycolic acid, where oversewing is using absorbable sutures. So in LSG literature, it's kind of unresolved right now, which is better. It seems like the trend has been more towards supporting the use of staple line treatment modalities. The largest systematic review today was Gagner, and it seemed to support the use of just SLR with certain materials, but not all, then oversew, then none. The numbers up there in the US only arm of their study because we're presenting on the MBSAQIP today. And then there's like very little literature in the RSG lit. So oversew or not, that was a study that isn't actually, I don't know if I can go back, but that's okay. Moon et al. Looked at if you should oversew or not, but all of those were also reinforced. And then in a 2016 MSBIC analysis, they looked at staple line treatments in addition to comparing laparoscopic to robotic. So here's our aims, characterize the patterns of staple line treatment in robotic sleeve gastrectomies, as well as compare the outcomes in any treatment versus no treatment, and any treatment could include both oversewing and SLR, and then compare SLR versus oversew. This was a retrospective analysis of the MBSAQIP. We excluded anyone who was under 18. Everything was identified via CPT code for sleeve gastrectomy, and with the surgical approach variable of robotic assisted. You can see everything we got rid of, anything that really was a concurrent procedure or could somehow confound the data. Final sample size was about 52,000. We made two comparisons, as I mentioned previously, any SLT versus none, and then also oversew alone versus SLR alone. We used propensity score adjustments with inverse probability of treatment weighting, which is a way that we can keep the whole set of patients by applying different weights to the probability that they would have received a treatment. So our outcomes of interest, I mentioned earlier that bleeds and leaks are the most important things. We did not consider those, mostly because in the MBSAQIP database, there is not a great way to identify those without going into the notes for reasons beyond like reoperation reason was because of a bleed or reoperation reason. Most studies somehow find various aggregations of variables. Instead, we just looked at the downstream effects. And then highlighted in red, you'll find everything that's not, well, everything is in this was listed within the major complications of the MBSAQIP Committee on Standardized Outcome Reporting. Anything highlighted in red has been additionally identified as a major cost burden, and I've continued highlighting those in red throughout this to make it easier to see. So here was our data set, and then this is our first comparison, any SLT versus no SLT. So for demographics, this lines up very well with the overall MBSAQIP data for laparoscopic sleeve gastrectomies, about 80% female, median BMI was about 43.5, age about 44.1, 64% of patients were white. 66.6% of these cases ended up featuring some form of staple line treatment. 42.2% used SLR alone, 10% oversew alone, and 13% used both. I'll draw your attention, though, to this portion of it. You can see that even though the number of robotic sleeve gastrectomies is increasing every single year, the percentage of cases using SLT is decreasing every single iteration. So for the first comparison, organ space SSI, 30-day reoperation, 30-day reintervention, as well as sepsis, unplanned intubation, extended ventilator use, and AKI were all found to be lower risk for people who received some type of staple line treatment. Notably, though, there were no differences in mortality. Even though there was a difference in sepsis, there was no difference in septic shock, nor any differences in 30-day readmission. We didn't characterize ER visits, but Moon, the paper I referred to earlier, found that there was a higher rate of ED visits with oversewn patients, but not readmissions, and that agrees with our data. Here's the table. We don't need to read through it, but I will just point to the fact that most of these complications are very low. In terms of their number and percent, the highest percentage is 3.59%, and that's for a 30-day readmission. Everything else hovers below 1%. And then, it's not really clicking. Here we go. All right, and the SLR alone versus oversew alone group, we found there was a higher risk of any SSI, surgical site SSI, not organ space SSI, septic shock, but not sepsis. So opposite of the first comparison, unplanned intubation and extended ventilator use. No difference in mortality, transfusion, 30-day reintervention, re-op, or readmission, or any unplanned ICUs. Again, here's the data. You can once again see that the majority of these are actually pretty low numbers. So in terms of discussing what we've seen, I think the most interesting thing is the rate of RSG going up while the rate of staple line treatment within that going down. I think there's a couple of reasons. So first of all, there is no data that I'm aware of, and I've looked into it, that supports having any indication for RSG over LSG. The number of robots purchased by academic institutions increased after the release of the XI in 2014. And so I do wonder if the number of robotic cases increasing is very much just a factor of like, smoke them if you got them, right? It's there, and there are upkeep costs associated with it, and if you need to use the robot for a procedure, you can, then you might as well. In terms of the decreasing amount of staple line treatment, part of it could be related to the fact that during the majority of this period, the literature was relatively equivocal about needing staple line treatments in the LSG literature. But also, previously, there was no robotic stapler until about 2018. That was 60 millimeters. That was released by Da Vinci then as a dedicated system. Prior to that, people were actually using laparoscopic staplers that had reinforcement already on them. So it's possible that by using the 60 millimeter stapler from Da Vinci, which did not, or for Da Vinci, which did not have any reinforcement materials on it, that instead the staple line treatment dropped down. Type 2 errors are definitely a possibility here. You saw how few complications happened in a lot of these groups, despite the fact that we had about 52,000 patients. And so it's possible that we're not picking up on some types of interactions that actually do exist. And then once again, here's our conclusions. I just want to point out that there's no differences in mortality, transfusion, cardiac arrest, or ICU admission, all of which are some of the most expensive complications and feared complications. Overall, it does seem like our data supports the use of staple line treatments over no staple line treatment, and then supports staple line reinforcement via buttressing over oversew. But obviously, it's a retrospective analysis, and there's a lot of confounding things based on how MBSAQIP tracks staple line reinforcement techniques. Here's my references, and I'm happy to take questions. Once again, I am a medical student, but if I cannot answer your question, it will be addressed in the oral presentation manuscript.